I asked the maid at the hotel where my wife was staying with her lover, to leave the divorce letter in their room. I didn't just leave a signed paper, I left my pain all contained in surgical, cruel and definitive words. I wrote with the blood still hot from the discovery, with the coldness of someone who doesn't go back. She would know that I knew everything, the hidden touches, the rehearsed excuses, the empty nights and the hastily deleted messages. They entered the room believing they would be protected by the anonymity of a luxury hotel, believing that the lies still welcomed them. But no. What awaited them was the end. I remember exactly the moment the plan was put into practice. I was in the hall, with my dress shirt folded at my elbows and my eyes heavy with insomnia. The chambermaid passed me with the white envelope in her hands, her hair tied into a hasty bun and the expression of someone who didn't want to interfere, but knew too much. He didn't look me in the eye. He entered the next room and came out seconds later. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of the door opening. Muffled laughter. Voices in intimate whispers. And then the dry sound of the paper being opened, followed by an even more devastating silence. I didn't need to be inside to feel the tension tear the air in half. It can't be, said through gritted teeth, he knows, that was barely audible, and the beginning of a series of justifications as cowardly as they were useless. I already knew everything. I had already crossed all the lines of naivety. They just didn't know that what was there wasn't just a divorce. It was a warning. A limit. An elegant cry written in size 12 font, but which carried the anger of years suffocated by a marriage that became a monologue. They tried to trick me later. They tried to keep the theater standing, as if it were possible to rewrite the script even with the curtains down. She cried. He hid. The two got lost in trying to justify what was never justified. But I didn't back down. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't beg. I had cried enough in silence before this. In the empty bed. On the couch where she said she was tired. On the cell phone locked with a password. In the new perfume that wasn't for me. They didn't know that, before the letter even reached the room, it had already been scanned and sent to her parents, her brothers, and her best friend who had always called me brother-in-law. Everyone read it. Everyone saw it. The betrayal, the proof, the contempt. She was exposed with the same coldness that betrayed me. I made a point of returning it in kind, but with emotional interest. I didn't scream, but I wrote. I didn't push, but I revealed. I made everyone around her see what I saw, feel what I felt. And the cruelest of all, I did it without taking off my suit, without getting my hands dirty. Just showing the raw, naked and documented truth. But what no one imagined, not even me, was what would come next. When I thought revenge was the end, I discovered it was just the beginning. When I thought her exposition would be the final point, she wrote a comma and tried to come back. Tried to reverse. He tried to use everything against me. She cried, called, knelt in front of her parents, invented versions, said that her lover was nothing, that it was a moment of weakness, that I was also to blame. But I remained silent. Because I already knew. I knew the game was going to change. I knew her mask would slip in public, as it did in private. And it fell hard. Little by little, the truth eroded her veneer. Friends began to move away. The family looks on with pity. The lover, well, the lover had more to lose than she did. And lost. And when everyone thought I would be in shambles, that I would be the man destroyed and humiliated, I was surprised. What no one knew was that I already had another woman. No, not a mistress. A friend. A presence. Someone who saw in me what my wife no longer saw. And that I, in the middle of my abyss, started to see too. I didn't cheat on her. Never. But I allowed the affection of someone real to remind me of who I was. I didn't seek, I didn't force. But when the storm passed, it was she who reached out. The irony of all this? It's just that my ex-wife was the last to find out about the new relationship. I found out when I saw my engagement photo on social media, a few months after the official separation. She was still living with her parents, trying to start over. And me? I was in a white suit, in an elegant garden, holding the hand of someone who never asked me for anything other than the truth. While she was looked at suspiciously by everyone around her, I was applauded. And for those who mattered most, for those who saw me suffer, quietly, with class. What destroyed her most was not the exposed betrayal, nor the public divorce. It was knowing that, even after everything, I was able to love again. And to be loved sincerely. She tried to call me the night of the engagement. Several times. He sent long messages. Desperate. Just asking for a coffee, a conversation. I didn't respond. I didn't even need to. The photo said it all. She wasn't invited. Time passed, but to this day she has not been able to rebuild anything. The lover? It disappeared. I didn't want to commit. She said that, it wasn't supposed to be like this, that she was emotionally unstable, that she wanted some time. He disappeared from her life with the same haste with which he got dressed in that room, when he read the letter I left. And she stayed there, with the pieces of a castle that she herself broke. Everything she did, what she planned, what she hid, came back to her with the force of a hurricane. With each attempt to get up, someone remembered the scandal. From the letter. From humiliation. And she sank a little more. I'm doing well. Happy. Loved. Respected. Not because I got revenge, but because I didn't get lost. Because through it all, I held tight to the one thing she never had, dignity. And sometimes I wonder, if she had known what would come after that letter, would she have opened that envelope? Or would I have run away sooner? That's the only answer I don't have yet. But what I discovered later, that changed everything. Because the truth, the real twist of the story was yet to come. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. All stories are fictional, created with the sole purpose of showing how infidelity destroys homes, corrodes feelings and leaves deep scars. May they serve as alert, reflection and awareness. Get ready, because what you're going to hear now is shocking. We want a good story, but not a good memory. Hugo and Emily met in a university cafe during a rainy afternoon in Lisbon. He was studying civil engineering, she was studying graphic design. The meeting happened by chance, or maybe not, when she dropped a notebook on the floor and he, with a spontaneous gesture, bent down to help her before even noticing the curious look she was already casting in his direction. The dialogue that followed was light, almost shy, as if they both felt there was something there, even if they barely knew what. Emily had a suppressed laugh and eyes that seemed to hide deep questions. Hugo, with his calm voice and reserved posture, emanated a confidence that didn't need to be proven. There was something complementary between them. Something silent that fit. Time did the rest. 6 months later, they already shared the same apartment. 2 years later, they married in front of emotional family and friends who witnessed the rare connection of a couple who seemed to have been molded for each other. The beginning of the marriage was a deep dive into what many call mature love. There was no exaggeration, nor any rush. Just a solid construction, made of small and consistent rituals, the coffees prepared in the morning with handwritten notes, the aimless walks through the city's old neighborhoods, the dinners where the food mattered less than the conversations. Hugo was meticulous, organized, a man of quiet principles. Emily was expansive, sensitive, and saw beauty in even the most banal things. The differences did not separate them, they were woven together in harmony. Over time, the two grew in their careers. Hugo became a partner in a medium-sized construction company, involved in projects that required precision, patience and a long-term vision. Emily became one of the most sought-after designers at a communications agency, always surrounded by creative minds, bold projects and chaotic demands. The work required overtime, sporadic travel, and events with important clients. But that was never a problem, or at least it didn't seem to be. Both were proud of the other's achievements. When she arrived home with her eyes shining from having closed a campaign with a big international brand, he listened attentively, sitting next to her on the sofa, holding her hand as if he knew the weight behind each victory. When he returned from a decisive meeting with foreign investors and opened a bottle of wine to celebrate, it was she who hugged him firmly, saying that she had always believed in him. The complicity between them was noticeable. He was the type of couple who seemed to communicate through their eyes. That at dinners with friends he exchanged complicit glances when someone said something funny or out of tone. Who maintained a routine where affection was not a spectacle, but a presence. Hugo used to let her sleep longer on Sundays and prepared breakfast like someone carrying out a love ritual. Emily wrote little messages on the glass walls of the bathroom with red lipstick: "Good luck today, you are everything, I'm with you." On social media, they were not an exaggeratedly exposed couple, but in the rare photos they posted together, the smiles were genuine, and the comments from friends always followed the same tone: perfect couple, made for each other. But life, even when it seems perfectly orchestrated, has its own dissonances. Small cracks that appear almost imperceptibly, hidden behind mechanical gestures, silences that are too comfortable, and routines that become as predictable as they are inevitable. Fatigue began to set in subtly. It wasn't about fighting, because they almost never argued. It was about absences. About the kisses that became brief. About the "how was your day," responded with "tiring, as always." Conversations about the future were replaced by checklists of the present. Weekend trips were delayed by urgent deliveries. Saturday lunches were replaced by last-minute meetings. And so, without warning, intimacy gave way to coexistence. Emily started spending more time away. Networking dinners, meetings with agency colleagues, 3- or 4-day trips. Hugo, in turn, sank deeper and deeper into projects that seemed to never end. At night, when they met in the kitchen, they still looked at each other with affection, but they no longer touched each other as before. They slept in the same room, but with their bodies distant, like two strangers who had learned to coexist in silence. She said she was tired. He said he understood. And so, day after day, they stopped talking about what they really felt. Because the fear of hurting sometimes speaks louder than the truth. Despite this, there were no clear indications that anything was wrong. No scandal. No definitive removal. They were, in everyone's eyes, a stable couple. They had a large, tastefully decorated house and an enviable social circle. They attended the same dinners, exchanged gifts on commemorative dates, and even laughed together watching old movies. But behind every smile there was an unspoken gap. A lack that they both felt, but that neither of them dared to name. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of pride. Or maybe because they still believed that time would resolve it. Emily was constantly praised for her work. Her most recent projects caught the attention of an international perfume brand, and she was tapped to front a campaign in Paris. It was 3 weeks of creative immersion in another time zone, another culture, another atmosphere. Hugo didn't complain. On the contrary, he supported, encouraged, gave her all the support she needed. But deep down, he felt disconnected. When she returned, she brought gifts, stories, and a different sparkle in her eyes. And he, even without wanting to, felt that there was something new in her. Something he didn't recognize. But he didn't ask. I didn't say anything. Because in their marriage, respect came before curiosity. At least that was how they had always built everything. On their wedding anniversaries, they maintained the tradition of handwriting letters to each other. Small statements kept in ivory envelopes and left on the breakfast table. This year, however, Hugo hesitated. He wrote, but not with the same fluidity. The words seemed forced. The emotion, rehearsed. When he delivered the letter, she smiled, read it in silence and thanked him with a light kiss on the forehead. He did not respond in writing. He said he preferred to say it in person. But that night, she was exhausted. She fell asleep before he even got out of the shower. And Hugo, for the first time, read his own letter twice, trying to understand where he had gotten lost. Emily began to show concerns that hadn't existed before. He talked about changing apartments, living closer to the center, adopting a dog. I wanted more lightness, he said. More real life. Hugo tried to keep up, but he felt increasingly out of step with her new rhythm. He started working late, accepting work trips that he would previously have refused. Little by little, he also created his own parallel routine. Not out of revenge or purposeful separation, but out of pure need to not feel invisible inside your own home. Close friends began to notice changes. Discreet comments emerged. A colleague commented to Hugo, during a coffee break, "Emily is shining lately, huh, what a phase." Hugo smiled, but inside he felt an discomfort that he couldn't name. Emily, when asked by a friend about how her marriage was going, responded with a short sentence, "Relax. He's a good person." Without enthusiasm. No depth. Just an observation. It was as if they were living in a marriage by inertia. Two good human beings who liked each other, but who no longer chose each other every day. Who respected the past, but no longer had the courage to face the present. And in this emotional limbo, both ceased to fully exist for each other. Hugo began to observe details that he hadn't seen before. Her delays. Messages responded to hastily. Laughter on your cell phone in the early hours of the morning. Not that she hid it, but she didn't explain it either. And he didn't ask. The trust between them was so solid that it bordered on conformity. And it was exactly at this point in history that everything began to change. Not with an explosion, but with small tremors that still didn't seem dangerous. The kind of noise that only those who truly love can hear. And Hugo listened. But contrary to what anyone would expect, he wasn't confrontational. Just watched. Waited. He thought. Because sometimes, silence has more power than any words. And love, when disappointed, doesn't scream, it shuts up. But there was something Emily would never have imagined. Something that, when it came to light, would forever change the course of that story. Because no matter how much she tried to maintain control, there was a truth that only he knew. And that, at the right moment, it would come to the surface with the force of a hurricane. And that was exactly why, when she arrived in that hotel room, she never expected to find that envelope. She had no idea that there, sealed with a name she knew so well, was not just the end of a marriage, but the beginning of something she would never be able to control. The rain was falling thinly on the glass of the office window when Hugo received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but the tone was different, too restrained, almost uncomfortable. It was a mutual friend of the couple, who avoided going into details, but let slip an enigmatic comment that kept bouncing around in her head for days. "You know, sometimes, the person closest to us is the one we actually see the least." The phrase sounded like an insinuation. He didn't respond, just said, "Thanks for worrying," and hung up. During the following days, doubt began to grow in silence, a slow-acting poison. Emily was increasingly distant, her answers shorter, her smiles more absent. She started avoiding Sundays at home, citing tiredness, meetings with the creative team, and campaign deadlines. The mid-afternoon calls no longer happened, and even the small gestures of care had disappeared, as if they had been erased from memory for convenience. Hugo tried to maintain his composure. He was dealing with new contracts, expanding the construction company's operations in other countries, and his time was taken up by commitments and short trips, which now seemed like an escape in disguise. But even in the midst of the rush, I couldn't ignore what was becoming increasingly evident. Emily was changing, and he felt it not just in the silences, but in the smallest details, the different smell of perfume when returning home, the showers taking too long, the smiles distracted looking at the cell phone screen. And most of all, the absence of guilt. It was as if she had convinced herself that everything was still the same as before, when in fact, everything was transforming. It was on a Friday afternoon that Hugo decided to stop waiting for answers. He got in the car and drove to the agency where Emily worked. Didn't go in. He stood on the other side of the street, watching the movement. 40 minutes passed before she left, not alone, but accompanied. The man was tall, dark-haired, confident-looking. The two talked laughing, close enough that they didn't seem like just coworkers. She was holding her cell phone, showing him something, and touching his arm in an intimate way. At one point, the two looked at each other in a way that hurt Hugo like a knife. There was nothing explicit, but everything was real. That which is made of silence, of complicity, of eyes that seek each other even when bodies still pretend to be distant. He didn't confront that day. He returned home early and spent the night in silence, pretending to be tired. Emily arrived late, said the team went out to celebrate the approval of a new campaign, kissed him on the forehead and went straight to the shower. In the bathroom mirror, the marks on her neck were discreet but not unnoticeable. Hugo didn't say anything. He went downstairs, picked up a glass of wine and stared at the emptiness of the room, where there used to be so much. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just decided that he would no longer be a hostage to doubt. In the following days, he began to observe more. Not as someone who suspects, but as someone who already knows and is just waiting for the right moment to act. He analyzed the schedules, the behavior patterns, the places she said she was. He crossed data, took notes in silence. And what he discovered was as devastating as expected. Emily wasn't just emotionally involved. He was lying, creating a parallel narrative, carefully constructed to maintain appearances. The meetings were fictitious, the events an excuse. The man who was with her was not new. They met at strategic times, in discreet places, with the tranquility of someone who was used to cheating. Hugo was overcome by a mixture of indignation and coldness. Something inside him had broken. But it wasn't just the heart, it was the image he had of marriage, the trust that held it all together. And with that breakdown came clarity. He wouldn't make a fuss, he wouldn't lower himself. It would make her see herself in the mirror of her own lie, make her face not only the end of her marriage, but the abyss between what she was and what she pretended to be. The following week, he did something she would never have imagined. He called an acquaintance who worked at a sophisticated hotel, one of the favorites of executives and discreet couples. Booked a suite. Made the reservation in her name. She contacted a trusted chambermaid, told her only what was necessary, paid in advance, explained where and when to leave an envelope. Inside it, there was not just a divorce letter. Call logs, screenshots of conversations, and dates with times that proved involvement were printed. There was a cruel elegance to the way he structured everything. As if to say, I saw everything. But I didn't scream. I just recorded it. That afternoon, when Emily announced that she would be staying out the night because of a project closing meeting, Hugo just wished her good luck and went out to dinner alone. She followed the plan, went to the hotel with the man who now occupied the space that, for years, had been hers. They entered the suite naturally, as if it was already part of a secret routine. But when they turned on the light in the room, they saw the white envelope on the bed. No name. Just left there, like someone leaving the key to a safe open. Emily recognized the writing style the moment she opened it. The first lines were calm, direct, devastating. There were no insults. There were truths. Hugo exposed the pain in a contained, almost poetic way, but firm as a sentence. She turned pale and sat on the edge of the bed, unable to breathe properly. The lover asked what it was, but she couldn't answer. He just handed over the envelope. The man read it in silence, his eyes widening when he saw that his name was also there. Hugo hadn't just found out. He knew everything. And, more than that, he knew how to make every detail fall on them with the force of an avalanche. The envelope also contained a warning: from tomorrow, everything will be public. Desperation took over them both. Emily called Hugo 5 times that night. He didn't answer. He sent long messages, some confusing, others pleading. None were answered. She insisted on returning home that morning, but the door was locked and the lights were off. The next day, when he tried to access the joint bank account, he found everything emptied. Blocked cards. And an email from a lawyer with the title, Initial Documentation for Marital Dissolution. No more words. Just what is necessary. And yet, more painful than any scream. The only thing she didn't know, was that this wasn't the end yet. Because what Hugo was preparing wasn't just a separation. It was the revelation of something bigger. Something that wasn't in the envelope, but that, when it came to light, would change everything. A secret that not even her lover knew. And that would put Emily's name in front of a mirror that she never had the courage to face. The silence that Hugo maintained in the following days was the calm before the storm. And the storm that would come later, that, not even she imagined. The room was dark when she entered, the dim light from the street filtering through the heavy curtains. Emily left her bag on the armchair and paused for a moment, as if that silent space still belonged to her. The environment was exactly as it had been left days before, but something seemed out of place. She walked to the closet and found it practically empty. The absence of his clothes was like a punch. She ran her fingers over the hangers, trying to understand what that meant, but the echo of the answer was already playing in her mind. He sat on the bed, holding the cell phone with trembling hands, scrolling through Hugo's old messages, looking for signs, some phrase, some pause, some tone that he had missed. She had been taken by surprise by the divorce, yes, but the subsequent silence was even more cruel. The man she thought she knew had become unreachable, almost a cold absence that hurt more than any confrontation. On the other side of the city, Hugo watched the lights of the hall where the most anticipated night of the year was about to begin. It was a gala corporate event, organized by his construction company, which was now launching a highly visible international project. All the main names in the sector would be present, investors, politicians, strategic partners. He wore a tailored suit, straightened hair, and a look that showed the exactitude of someone who knows what he is about to do. There was no hesitation, no hatred in his chest. Just the conviction that this would be the final chapter of a story he never asked to live. Emily had also been invited. The invitation arrived days before the discovery of the envelope in the hotel, still under the pretext of social prestige, without her knowing that it was already part of Hugo's past. He accepted on impulse. I needed to see him. I needed to understand. At 8:30, she entered the room wearing an intense red dress, her hair tied into an elegant bun and her eyes looking for just one face among so many. And he found it. But not alone. Next to Hugo, arm in arm with him, was a woman she knew. A woman who was always close, but never threatening. Lara. His childhood friend. Image consultant for the construction company in recent years. Discreet, polite, intelligent. And now, his bride. Emily felt the blood leave her face. A waiter passed her offering champagne, but she couldn't hold the glass. He watched them both like someone watching a film in which they don't recognize themselves. The way he looked at her, calmly and tenderly, the way she leaned on him with lightness and intimacy. That wasn't new. That was built. And Emily understood. He understood that he had arrived late. Too late. The evening continued with speeches, toasts and presentations. When Hugo took the stage to talk about the company's new project, the applause was immediate. But it was in the second part of his speech that the atmosphere changed. His voice became slower, more emotionally charged. He talked about the company's journey, the sacrifices made, the support from important people over the years. And then, as if deciding to turn the key once and for all, he mentioned Lara's name, saying that she had been fundamental not only in the structure of the new project, but also in rebuilding his own life. And, in front of everyone, he announced their engagement, thanking her for believing in him even at times when he himself had stopped believing. The hall erupted in applause. Everyone stood up. Everyone except Emily. She left before the party ended. She walked through the streets with uncertain steps, her heels punishing her feet, but without her noticing. I was anesthetized. He sat down on a park bench, still with the phone in his hand. Called. Hugo answered after the fourth ring. His voice was firm, but there was no anger. She asked to meet him. He said where he was. Minutes later, they were face to face, in an almost empty restaurant in the city center. The table in the corner was discreet, and the waiter didn't even come close when he saw the atmosphere between the two. Emily started speaking too quickly, trying to explain what couldn't be explained. He said her mistake was not justifiable, but he still wanted to apologize. That he had lost control, that he felt invisible. That he no longer knew who he was. And finally, that she still loved him. Hugo listened to her in silence. There was no sarcasm, no anger, no pity in his eyes. Just a biting serenity. When she finished, he took a deep breath and said there was no more room for that. That love cannot survive on rubble. That he had rebuilt his life not to hurt her, but to survive what she caused. And then, with a devastating calm, she added that there was something she still didn't know. Emily frowned. He looked into her eyes and said, with the precision of someone who thought about every word, the divorce letter was not left in that room by chance. The reservation was made by me. The hotel, the hours, the name at reception. Everything was under my control. But that's not the most important thing. The real reason for that night wasn't just to end our story. It was revealing something you never predicted. Emily couldn't breathe properly. Hugo opened his wallet and took out a card. He placed it on the table. A name. An address. And a logo. She took the card with shaking hands. His eyes widened when he noticed the name of the advertising company he had been negotiating with to become a partner in a new project. It was the same company that, coincidentally, belonged to the investment group recently acquired by Hugo's construction company. Without knowing it, Emily had presented her portfolio and discussed clauses with one of her ex-husband's business arms. During the last few weeks, he had followed her every step. Silently. Analyzing, studying, deciding. Emily looked up at him in disbelief. Do you think you were approved for talent? Didn't you notice the identical emails asking you to resend already sent materials? Weren't you suspicious of the interviews scheduled at times when they knew you would be with him? Didn't you realize that all of that was monitored? She was silent, unable to say anything. Hugo continued, now with slightly teary eyes, I didn't do it out of revenge. I did it for justice. So that you could see, for a moment, what it's like to have your life in the hands of someone who decides, without you knowing. I made it so that you understand what it's like to be betrayed not just with your body, but with your trust. And now, after everything, I release you. But know that every door that closes for you from now on will not be because of me. It will be for your image, for your story, for your truth. Emily stood up, but her legs gave out. He held the edge of the table. His eyes were red. The words he tried to form didn't come out. Just a whisper of pain, like someone who finally understands that they have lost something they will never get back. Hugo got up, left some notes on the table and left. And in that moment, Emily didn't cry about being left. She cried because she realized that, while she cheated, he built. While she lied, he prepared himself. And when he thought he had control of the situation, it was already part of his plan. Emily stood in front of the empty table for long seconds after Hugo left. The notes he left behind were still fluttering slightly under the air-conditioning draft. She didn't know whether to cry, scream or just run away and pretend nothing had happened. But there were no more pretenses possible. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her feet with such precision that she didn't even have time to prepare for the fall. He stumbled out of the restaurant, his eyes fixed on the card he still held between his fingers. The street seemed to revolve around her, cars passed by, horns sounded in the distance, but she barely heard them. She got into the car, started the engine and drove aimlessly, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if that would stop her from collapsing. I didn't want to go home, I didn't want to see the mirror, I didn't want to face the emptiness of my own choices. He stopped in front of the sea, opened the windows and let the cold wind touch his face while silent tears flowed without permission. The next day, his attempt to contact the company to confirm the card's contents was met with evasions. The receptionist seemed trained to say the least. Emily insisted, but the answer was clear: internal decisions are confidential and we do not comment on selection processes. A polite phrase that hit a definitive no. He felt his chest tighten again. Until that moment, there was still a part of her that believed maybe it was too much. That maybe Hugo was just hurt and used the power to teach a lesson. But the veiled confirmation of his exclusion from the society he hoped to conquer showed him that this wasn't just about revenge, it was about consequences. He then started calling contacts, seeking information, reversing the situation with some convincing narrative. But the answers came in the form of uncomfortable silences or polite apologies. The doors, one by one, were closing. Meanwhile, Hugo went about his life with a tranquility that could easily be mistaken for coldness. But it wasn't. It was maturity. It was the conscience of someone who had made a difficult but necessary decision. Lara, his fiancée, accompanied him with a firm but discreet presence. She never asked for details about what happened to Emily. I trusted that he would share when he felt he should. And he felt it. Little by little, he began to open his wounds, not in dramatic explosions, but in fragments of everyday life, like someone carefully undoing knots. He talked about the years in which he felt ignored, about the absences disguised as routine, about the first time he became suspicious and decided to remain silent so as not to lose himself in fear. Lara listened to everything with attentive eyes, without interrupting, just holding his hand, firm, without promises, without ready-made sentences. Days later, Emily had access to the company contract that she almost signed. An internal contact, perhaps out of compassion, emailed him an anonymous copy. When he opened it, he noticed that his name appeared on the preliminary versions, praising his competence. But there were notes at the bottom of the last page: ethical incompatibility. Unreliable track record for institutional representations. She dropped her cell phone on the couch, her face screwed up in shame and indignation. His reputation, once intact, was tarnished. And the most painful thing, stained by actions that she herself chose, not by chance or by someone else's setup. The following week, an exhibition organized by an old client provided space for Hugo to present a new social project linked to the construction company. It was an education and professional reintegration project for underprivileged young people. A sensitive, emotional work that attracted attention from the media. Emily, still trying to rebuild what little prestige she had left, went to the event. I thought about making contacts, showing presence, and maybe finding an opening. But I didn't expect to be seen. When Hugo entered the room with Lara, the flashes turned to them. The cameras captured the moment he held his bride's hand and spoke about the role of ethics in corporate decisions. Emily listened from the side of the stage, hidden but not indifferent. Every word seemed directed at her, even though he had never spoken her name. He felt his throat close when he saw the two come down from the stage hand in hand, greeting those present with the serenity of someone who knows exactly their place. He then decided to try one last move. He waited until the end of the event and approached Hugo in the parking lot. He was about to get into the car, but when he saw her standing there hesitantly, he stopped. His gaze was calm but distant. Emily, her voice cracking, asked for just 5 minutes. Hugo hesitated, looked at Lara inside the car, who nodded slightly. He approached. Emily began by saying that she was not seeking pity, nor reconciliation. He said he knew he had destroyed something rare, but that he needed to talk, even if it was just to clear his chest. He confessed that he never believed that Hugo was capable of going so far. Who knew him as a fair man, but not as someone who would use his intelligence and resources to dismantle someone in such a silent and perfect way. And it was at that moment that he spoke, low, firm. You always underestimated me. He always thought my silence was weakness. That my patience was a convenience. That my lack of reaction was incapacity. And for a long time, perhaps I harbored this vision. But I've changed, Emily. At the exact moment I realized that you no longer looked at me as someone to share your life with, I started to build mine without you. And I did it with pain, yes, but with dignity. She tried to interrupt, but he raised his hand. You think the most painful thing was the betrayal. It wasn't. It was realizing that, even after everything, you still saw yourself as a victim. That, even with the evidence in your hands, you cared more about your reputation than what you destroyed. I didn't need to destroy your life. She herself imploded with her choices. I just, let the truth come out. Emily stood there, silent, looking at him with teary eyes. Hugo got a little closer. Lara didn't come into my life as a replacement. She arrived when I was no longer looking for you. When I understood that loving someone is not accepting being erased every day. And with her, I am seen. I am heard. And above all, I am respected. She took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears. I just wanted you to know that. I regret it too. He looked at her for a few seconds. And then, with an expression of understanding, but not forgiveness, he replied, repentance is a starting point. But it doesn't change what was done. The time is yours now. To understand. To grow. To deal. He got into the car. Lara looked at Emily with a mix of empathy and firmness. No words were said. The car drove off slowly, leaving behind the woman who, once, was everything, but who was now just part of a story that had been overcome. Emily stayed there for a while, sitting on the wall of the parking lot, looking at the ground, thinking about how many times she believed she was in control. How many times did she manipulate words, schedules, feelings, believing that she would never be discovered. Now, he understood that love, when betrayed, does not take revenge with screams or scandals. Revenge with silence. With absence. With the peace of those who move forward knowing they did the right thing. And that peace, at that moment, was everything she didn't have. Time hasn't stopped for Emily. On the contrary, she advanced with a weight that she was unable to support. The days following her last meeting with Hugo seemed longer, more dense, as if every minute forced her to face the reflection of what she had become. The pain did not come in waves, but in constant tides that gave no respite. Regret was a permanent, silent and cruel visitor, who accompanied her in the mornings, in lonely cafes, on the nights when she tried unsuccessfully to sleep. She had lost everything that really mattered, and as much as she tried to rebuild something in her professional life, nothing had the same shine. Invitations to events stopped, messages from clients disappeared, and even the closest friends started to keep their distance. Not out of judgment, but out of discomfort. It was as if his presence reminded everyone that even the most stable stories can fall apart in devastating ways. Emily tried to rework her routine, believing movement would bring some form of relief. He woke up early and walked through the streets of the neighborhood as if he were looking for something he already knew he wouldn't find. She went into cafes trying to remember past moments, forced smiles on strangers, pretended to be okay when someone from the past recognized her. But nothing filled the void that he had stopped ignoring. And there was something even more distressing, Hugo's silence. Not that he expected forgiveness, but the complete absence of any attempt at rapprochement made everything more definitive. He kept going, and it tore her apart more than any screaming or arguing would have. Meanwhile, Hugo maintained his new rhythm of life with balance. The relationship with Lara evolved naturally, without rushing, but with depth. They shared not just the good times, but also the vulnerabilities. Lara knew he still carried marks, and he didn't try to erase them. He just offered space for them to heal without rushing. Little by little, Hugo returned to old pleasures, such as reading at night with a glass of wine, running in the morning without headphones, enjoying silence without feeling lonely. And it was in this process of reuniting with himself that he began to reevaluate everything he had experienced. Not with regret, but with maturity. He understood that despite the pain, he had come out stronger. More aware. And it gave him a new perspective on what he wanted from now on. The dilemma, however, arose unexpectedly. One of the international investors with whom the construction company was about to close a partnership appointed, as a requirement for the contract, a specific creative director for the marketing of the new project. And the name indicated was Emily. The recommendation came from the company's headquarters, in another country, where its history had not been affected. Professionally, she was still admired. The news reached Hugo through his partner, who did not know about the past between the two. And there, sitting in front of the proposal, Hugo found himself facing a decision that didn't just involve business, but principles. I could easily veto the name. He had the power to do so. All that was needed was a technical argument, a discrete justification. But something inside him resisted. Hugo spent the night thinking. Laura noticed the discomfort and asked if it was something related to work. He hesitated, then counted. He didn't hide anything from her. Laura listened carefully, pondered, and responded with a serenity that touched him deeply. She said it wasn't her place to give an opinion, but that true forgiveness doesn't reside in the words spoken, but in the attitudes we choose when no one expects anything from us. That kept playing in Hugo's mind. He didn't want a rematch. I had already done what I needed to do. He had already positioned himself. Perhaps allowing Emily to hold the role did not signify reconciliation or benevolence, but simply maturity. The next day, Hugo authorized the hiring. He didn't warn Emily. Didn't send messages, didn't make calls. He just let the procedures continue. When she received the email formally accepting the proposal, it took her minutes to understand that it was real. There were no intermediaries, there was no interview, just the invitation to sign the contract. He thought it was a mistake. Or a trap. But it wasn't. It was the chance she didn't expect to get back. And more than that, it was a gesture that confronted her with the biggest dilemma of her life. Emily spent days thinking about whether she should accept. I was fully aware that this was not a favor. It was a test. A chance to show who you were now, not who you were. And that scared her more than losing her position. Because, for the first time, he felt that what was at stake was not a position or a name on the door of a room, but his identity, his value as a human being. Decided to accept. But not before sending an email. Short, direct, but with the depth of someone who recognizes the weight of what has been experienced. In the body of the message, he simply wrote that he was aware of the dimension of the gesture, and that, even without expecting anything other than a professional response, he would like to thank him for his respect, for his trust, and for having shown him, with actions and not with words, that it was still possible to move forward with dignity. There was no response. I didn't even expect it. And that, in itself, said it all. Professional coexistence in the early days was tense, but civilized. Emily maintained an ethical stance, delivered results with excellence and did not, at any time, try to seek personal proximity. Hugo, in turn, treated her with the same respectful neutrality that he dedicated to everyone else. And it was precisely this gentle coldness that, in a way, redeemed her. Because, unlike anger, which feeds grudges, dignified indifference teaches. And Emily learned. He learned that betrayal not only destroys the relationship with others, but mainly with one's own conscience. That when the limit of trust is exceeded, the way back is not made with apologies, but with concrete actions, with silence, with patience. One afternoon, during a meeting with the international team, Hugo was surprised by a compliment from the foreign representative. He said that the choice of creative director was the right one, that the project had gained strength and consistency with her vision. Hugo just nodded. Later, when he passed Emily in the hallway, their eyes met for a moment. There was no arrogance, no victimization. Just a silent recognition from someone who knew exactly what that moment represented. And he responded with a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture, a slight nod of the head. It wasn't forgiveness. It was respect. That night, Hugo arrived home feeling lighter. He sat with Lara in the garden and told her what had happened. She smiled, held his hand and said that, sometimes, winning is not about defeating the other, but learning to live in peace even in the face of marks that no one sees. He agreed silently. I didn't need to say anything. He felt whole. Strong. Human. And ready for whatever came. Emily, on the other hand, arrived at the rented apartment where she now lived alone and slowly took off her shoes. He sat on the floor of the empty room, leaning against the wall, and closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. There were no achievements to celebrate, but there was, finally, a kind of peace. An intimate recognition that he was trying to rebuild himself from the rubble. And that, even if no one saw her that way, she knew how much it hurt every step taken in that direction. The past did not erase. But at that moment, perhaps for the first time, he no longer crushed her. She had stopped being just the woman who cheated. She slowly became the woman who dealt with the consequences. And this reconstruction, carried out in the silence of ordinary days, was worth more than any speech. Time was beginning to rearrange the pieces. And something, yet to come, would give definitive meaning to their trajectory. Something that would close the cycle with the strength that only the truth can bring. On that sunny autumn morning, the weather was calm, but charged with something invisible, as if the air knew that some cycle was about to end definitively. Hugo woke up earlier than usual, put on a light shirt and walked in silence to the balcony, where the sun fell softly on the plants that he himself tended. He was about to embark on a new trip, now to present his company at an international conference, and Lara would go with him. They had already made their engagement official in an intimate way and were planning the wedding without rushing, prioritizing the emotional stability that united them. The relationship between them was not driven by effusive promises or grandiose plans, but by a constant presence, by a partnership that had been built on the rubble of a difficult past, and which now flourished with serenity and truth. She respected him for who he was, and he found her not just a woman, but a refuge, a place where he could finally exist without needing to prove himself. While Hugo calmly packed his bags on the other side of town, Emily faced a decision she had been putting off for weeks. Sitting in front of a blank screen, with a partially written resignation email, she watched as the words tried to tumble out of her fingers like stones. The project was progressing well, its participation was being recognized and the results obtained would guarantee it a good position in the market. However, there was something that stopped her from following. It wasn't fear of other people's judgment, nor of the loneliness that had accompanied her since the breakup, but a moral discomfort that grew every day. I was being applauded for skills that were real, but behind each recognition I felt the weight of an unresolved past. Working alongside Hugo forced her to face, every day, a version of herself that she still didn't know how to forgive. And no matter how much professionalism prevailed, there was an invisible wall between her and peace. He then decided to do something he had never considered, quit. Not out of weakness, but out of conscience. Walking away was a form of respect, a way of admitting that she was not yet ready to rebuild her image where so much pain had been deposited. Before sending the email, he wrote a letter. Not for him. For herself. An intimate confession in which he narrated everything he experienced, not as a justification, but as an attempt at understanding. He kept the letter in a box, along with other items from his history with Hugo, and locked the drawer. I needed to move on, but in another direction. He resigned the next day, with a discreet and elegant statement. When Hugo found out, he just nodded. I already expected it. And although he didn't say a word about it, he felt that somehow that gesture closed the last chapter of what they lived through. Some time later, Emily decided to accept a proposal in another country. A smaller agency, with a creative profile, where no one knew about it. It was alone, without fuss. She started over with humility, without the weight of a recognized name, without the shine that once surrounded her. There, for the first time in a long time, she was just an ordinary professional, trying to reconnect with what she was once passionate about. The nights were still long, and Sundays were still lonely, but something in his eyes had changed. I no longer sought to be admired. I just tried to be honest with who I became day after day. And in that silent search, he found a strength he never had while pretending to be someone else. Hugo, in turn, carried no grudges. Not even longing. What was inside him now was gratitude for having escaped a life built on appearances. Over time, he found himself freer, lighter, and each achievement began to have a different flavor. It was no longer about proving that I could win, but about enjoying what was true. His wedding to Lara took place months later, in an intimate ceremony surrounded by friends who witnessed not only a new love, but the resilience of someone who did not allow himself to be defined by pain. And that night, as they danced under the yellow light of the streetlights, with their bare feet on the grass and their laughter mixing with soft music in the background, Hugo knew he had finally arrived at the place he always wanted to be. It wasn't a house, nor a business. It was a state of mind. An internal home. Years passed. And one day, by chance, on a flight to a conference, the two met again. They sat in different rows, they didn't speak to each other during boarding, but they recognized each other with a slight glance. There was no pain, no hurt, just the silent recognition between two people who once were everything and were now just memories. At the end of the flight, they passed each other at the exit. Emily said a polite, "Good morning," Hugo returned a gentle wave. There was no conversation, and it wasn't necessary. That was enough. Time had already done everything it needed to. And at that moment, each one followed through their landing gate, towards different destinations, carrying not the scars, but the lessons. And so, a story that began with promises and ended with silence, served to remind us that love does not always resist, but that dignity, when preserved, transforms losses into liberation. And sometimes, the greatest gesture of courage is to continue, even when everything seems lost. Because living, after all, is learning to move forward without dragging what no longer has a place. Now tell me in the comments what you thought of this story. Would you have made the same decisions? Would I have forgiven? Would I have been able to move forward with that dignity? I really want to know your opinion. And if you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell and leave a like. Here, all stories are fiction, created to provoke reflection. And always remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Infidelity destroys more than relationships, it breaks the essence of trust. Until the next story.